On the morning of December 7, 1941, one man spoke three quiet words that would ignite the deadliest conflict America had ever faced. Tora, tora, tora. They sounded simple, almost harmless, but those three syllables, whispered across the Pacific by Mitsuo Fukuda, were the signal that the United States had been caught completely off guard. A few seconds later, hundreds of Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor, and the world changed forever. What almost nobody in America knew at the time was that the man who sent that message would one day walk the streets of the United States, shake hands with former enemies, and reveal secrets that Japan had buried deep inside its wartime archives. Secrets about why the attack happened, why certain decisions were made, what he truly felt as he watched the harbor burning beneath him, and why, 30 years later, he returned not as a warrior but as a man carrying a confession. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe so you don't lose this story, because this is not just about the attack on Pearl Harbor. It is about the man who became its voice, and the truth he carried with him until the end of his life. Mitsuo Fukuda was already a legend within the Imperial Japanese Navy long before December 7th. A charismatic officer, an expert navigator, a perfectionist pilot. He had flown more than 50 combat missions across China and the Pacific, survived close calls that should have killed him, and earned a reputation for discipline that bordered on obsession. To Japanese command, he was the ideal man to lead the strike on Pearl Harbor. To his subordinates, he was the kind of commander who would rather die than make a mistake. And on that morning, he believed he was making history in Japan's favor. When he peered through the small glass window of his aircraft at dawn, the scene below looked too good to be real. Battleships lined up neatly at battleship row, fuel tanks sitting unguarded, aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip with no attempt at dispersal, sailors still asleep on deck. He later wrote that it felt like an invitation, a moment designed by fate. But decades later, Fukuda would confess something that historians still debate. He was terrified, not of American guns, not of the mission failing, but of what would come after the attack succeeded. He understood the industrial power of the United States. He understood the American spirit. He knew that Japan's leaders believed a rapid, devastating strike would force America to negotiate. But Fukuda privately believed the opposite, that an attack like this would unleash a fury Japan could never contain. As his aircraft descended, he gave the order to begin the assault. Bombs fell toward the harbor. Torpedo planes skimmed low over the water. Dive bombers screamed down from the sky. Fukuda watched explosions ripple across the ships beneath him, the Arizona erupting into a fireball, the Oklahoma rolling over, the West Virginia sinking lower and lower. To his superiors, these were victories. To Fukuda, they looked like the opening act of a tragedy. Years later, when he returned to Pearl Harbor, he admitted something remarkable. As he watched the Arizona explode, he felt a sudden chill, as if he had just opened a door that could never be closed. He said he saw not enemies, but human beings. Men running through smoke, jumping into burning oil, trying to save their shipmates. He said, "I realized we had awakened a sleeping giant." One of Fukuda's shocking revelations came from a secret he kept for years. Japan almost canceled the attack. A storm at sea nearly scattered the carrier fleet. Fuel shortages created delays. A mechanical malfunction in his own aircraft nearly prevented him from sending the Tora message. Japanese intelligence had failed miserably. They expected multiple American carriers to be present, yet not a single one was in harbor. In his later writings, Fukuda admitted that the attack succeeded less because of Japanese skill and more because of American unpreparedness and sheer luck. But the most controversial part of his story involved the third wave. According to Fukuda, he urged Admiral Chuichi Nagumo to launch a third attack on fuel tanks, dry docks, workshops, and submarine bases, the facilities that would have crippled the Pacific Fleet for years. Nagumo refused. He feared American counterattack and believed Japan had already achieved enough. Decades later, Fukuda insisted that the third wave was Japan's last chance at victory. If we had destroyed the fuel reserves, he said, the war in the Pacific could not have been sustained. Historians still debate whether this is true, but one thing is certain. The United States recovered far faster than Japan ever expected. By 1943, America was producing aircraft at a rate Japan could not match. By 1944, American carriers dominated the Pacific, and by 1945, Japan was in ruins. While Japan collapsed, Fukuda survived repeated brush-ins with death. He survived the sinking of the carrier Akagi at Midway, only because an illness kept him off the flight deck that morning. He survived a bombing that killed every single officer in his unit except him. He survived a hospital explosion that buried him under rubble. He survived a crash landing that shattered his legs. And when he was sent as part of a team to inspect the ruins of Hiroshima, everyone exposed alongside him died of radiation poisoning. He lived. It became a legend in Japan. The man who could not die, but Fukuda believed there was a reason. He said he survived because history needed someone to tell the truth, to speak for the Japanese pilots who never came home, and to confront the darker side of the war that Japan tried to hide. When the war ended, Fukuda returned to a nation in ruins. His home was destroyed. His country was starving. His military career evaporated overnight. For years, he struggled with guilt and bitterness. He expected Americans to hate him. He expected to live the rest of his life in obscurity. But something unexpected happened. When he met American veterans, they treated him with respect rather than hatred. He was stunned. These were the men whose ships he had bombed, whose friends he had killed, whose lives he had forever changed, yet they shook his hand. This moment would reshape the rest of his life. In 1952, he traveled to the United States for the first time. There, he met American officers who had fought in the Pacific. They told him stories he had never heard about courage, about sacrifice, about the brutality of the war from their side. He realized that the enemy he once imagined was not a single-minded monster, but men fighting for survival and for their country just like him. Over the next decades, Fukuda became a public speaker, sharing insights about the war that no one else could. He shocked Americans by revealing Japan's early doubts about the attack. He shocked Japanese veterans by criticizing imperial leadership, and he shocked historians with the emotional honesty he had once buried behind military discipline. By the time he returned to Pearl Harbor in the 1970s, he was no longer the man who had shouted "Tora, Tora, Tora." He was older, quieter, reflective. He walked past the memorials, spoke to survivors, and spent long moments staring at the water where so many had died. He told a reporter, "I came here today as a man seeking peace, not as the warrior I once was." Before his death in 1976, he said 3 things he hoped Americans and Japanese would remember. First, that Pearl Harbor was a tactical success but a strategic catastrophe. Second, that Japan's leadership had never understood the strength and resolve of the American people. And third, that he regretted the attack more with each passing year. Because the truth of war is that nobody wins. Everyone loses. History will always remember him as the man who launched the attack, but Fukuda hoped that his later words would matter just as much as his earlier actions. As Mitsuo Fukuda walked through post-war Japan, he saw things he had never imagined during his years as a celebrated naval officer. Families searching for food in ruins, children playing in burned-out streets because they had nowhere else to go, entire neighborhoods turned to ash. He had once believed Japan was the rising power of Asia, guided by destiny. Now he realized the empire had collapsed under the weight of its own illusions. The military leaders he had trusted had hidden the truth from their own people, and he had helped carry out their decisions without question. In the years after the war, Fukuda faced a different kind of battle, one against his own memories. He remembered the faces of the men he commanded, pilots who never returned, crews who vanished into the Pacific. He remembered the roar of engines over Pearl Harbor, the flames rising from Battleship Row, the smoke drifting across the mountains of Oahu. These memories haunted him at night, more painful with each passing year. He once admitted to a close friend, "We believed in glory, but we found only destruction." For a long time, he could not talk about the attack he had led. Japan was ashamed of Pearl Harbor. America was scarred by it. Everywhere he went, the moment hung between him and the people he met and spoken yet ever present. But eventually, the silence became too heavy. In the mid-1950s, Fukuda decided to write his own account of the mission, not to justify it, but to understand it. He wanted to explain what went through his mind that morning, what he saw, what he felt, and why Japan made the choices it did. When the book was published, American veterans read it with disbelief, not because it defended Japan, but because it revealed things even the U.S. Navy had not known. American intelligence had intercepted Japanese codes, but had never fully understood the internal debate within Japan's high command. Fukuda exposed how divided Japanese leadership had been. Some generals believed attacking America was madness. Others insisted it was the only way to secure Japan's future. Fukuda himself, in his writings, admitted he was torn, loyal to his country, yet fearful of the consequences. One of the most emotional passages in his memoir described his return to Hiroshima after the atomic bombing. He was one of the first officers sent to inspect the ruins. He walked through streets where nothing was left standing. He saw bodies turned to shadows against walls. He saw a city so completely destroyed that even his memories of it felt unreal. Years later, Americans would ask him what he thought at that moment. He answered quietly, "When I saw the destruction of Hiroshima, I understood why Pearl Harbor had been a mistake. We started something we could never finish." This confession shocked many in Japan. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been romanticized for years after the war, portrayed as a daring strike by heroic pilots. Fukuda shattered that myth. He spoke honestly about the flaws in Japan's strategy, the mistakes made by leaders, and the inevitable defeat that followed. And because he had been at the center of it all, his words carried weight that other voices could not match. During his travels in the United States, Fukuda was invited to speak at military academies and veterans groups. At one event, he met an American sailor who had survived the explosion on the USS Arizona. The man had lost friends, suffered burns, and carried emotional scars for decades. Yet when he learned Fukuda was present, he approached him and extended his hand. Fukuda later described the moment as one of the most humbling experiences of his life. "I had expected hatred," he said, "but I found forgiveness instead." These encounters changed him deeply. He began to see the war not in terms of nations or armies, but in terms of individuals. Human beings caught in decisions they did not make. This understanding fueled his desire to speak openly about the war and to share what he had learned. He believed that if former enemies could shake hands, then future generations could avoid repeating the same mistakes. As the decades passed, Fukuda became something of a bridge between Japanese and American veterans. He attended reunions, spoke at memorials, and answered letters from historians, students, and veterans who wanted to understand the man behind Tora. Some forgave him easily, some never fully could, but most appreciated his honesty. One of the most powerful stories he shared came from the night before the attack on Pearl Harbor. He described standing on the deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, staring at the dark horizon. The sea was calm. The sky was silent. The fleet moved like a ghost across the Pacific. He later said, "I felt as though I was standing between two worlds, one ending and one beginning." That moment stayed with him for the rest of his life. Fukuda also revealed that Japanese pilots had not been told the full truth about the mission. They had been assured that America would be too shocked to fight back effectively. They had been told the U.S. Navy would need years to rebuild. They had not been warned about American industry, American resolve, or the resource advantage the United States held. Japan had believed it could deliver a knockout punch. Fukuda admitted, "We only woke the giant." In his later life, he spent time reflecting on the men he fought alongside. He spoke of their bravery, their sacrifices, their dedication, but he also condemned the leaders who had used that bravery for the wrong reasons. He said, "Our courage was real, our cause was not." Near the end of his life, he visited Pearl Harbor one final time. He stood on the memorial above the USS Arizona, looking at the oil still leaking slowly from the wreck below. Sailors called it the tears of the Arizona. For a long time, he said nothing. Finally, he whispered, "This is where history changed." For him, Pearl Harbor was not just a battle. It was the beginning of a lesson he spent decades learning. A lesson about pride, responsibility, loss, and humanity. When he died in 1976, he left behind a legacy unlike any other Japanese officer. He was the man who launched the attack and a man who later explained why it should never have happened. He was a warrior who survived everything, only to become a messenger for peace, and in his final writings, he said something that resonates even today. "If history remembers me only for the attack, then it remembers only half of who I became." As the years passed, the world around Mitsuo Fukuda Fukuda changed rapidly, but the memory of December 7th never left him. Every time he heard aircraft overhead, he remembered the sound of the engines of the first wave. Every time he saw the American flag, he remembered how it had still flown over burning ships as he circled above Pearl Harbor. He once said that the image of the American flag rising through the smoke stayed imprinted in his mind more deeply than the explosions themselves. In the interviews, Fukuda described how the Japanese military had been trapped in its own mythology. Japan believed it was destined to rule Asia, destined to challenge the West, destined to prove its superiority. This was the narrative he had been raised under. It was a narrative that shaped him from the moment he joined the Navy as a young cadet. But after the war, he realized how much of that narrative had been built on deception, wishful thinking, and political manipulation. He said, "We grew up believing the empire could not fail, but we failed because we never understood reality." One of the most striking moments in his later speeches came when he described the Japanese mindset. Going into the war, he explained that Japan believed America was soft, distracted, divided, and unwilling to fight. Japanese leaders assumed that Americans, being a wealthy and comfortable people, would collapse under pressure, but he confessed that the attack on Pearl Harbor revealed just the opposite. The United States proved capable of extraordinary unity and determination. Factories converted overnight from civilian production to full military output. Car companies produced aircraft engines. Appliance manufacturers produced machine guns. Shipyards built carriers in a fraction of the time Japan required to construct a single destroyer. Fukuda often said, "We misjudged the power of a free nation." He also spoke about the Japanese pilots who participated in the mission. Many of them were young, barely in their 20s, full of energy, pride, and belief in their country. Fukuda understood that they had been indoctrinated into a system that demanded loyalty above all else. Years later, when he met American veterans who were the same age during the war, he often said the same thing. "We were all young men doing what we were told. The uniforms were different, but the hearts were the same." In his personal writings, he described the burden of survival. Survivor's guilt was something he struggled with deeply. So many of the pilots he commanded never returned from their missions. They died believing Japan would win the war. They died believing their sacrifices had meaning. When Fukuda lived long enough to see the truth that the war had been based on falsehoods, he felt the weight of being one of the few who remain. He wrote, "I lived long enough to understand the lies. My friends died before they could." As he traveled and gave lectures, he noticed that different countries remembered the war in different ways. Americans viewed Pearl Harbor as a moment of betrayal, a wound that sparked righteous anger. Japanese veterans saw it as both a point of pride and a symbol of tragedy. Younger generations in both countries sometimes saw it as distant history, disconnected from their own lives. Fukuda made it his mission to remind them that history is not distant. It is a chain of human choices, each one shaping the next. One of the most emotional encounters of his late life happened during a visit to a naval base. In the United States, a young sailor approached him shyly and said he had studied Pearl Harbor in school and wanted to understand what the Japanese pilots had felt. Fukuda placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and said, "We felt fear, determination, and confusion. The same feelings you would feel in war. War does not change human emotions, only their direction." There was another revelation he shared that surprised many Americans. He admitted that Japanese pilots were not told the full scale of the mission until the very last moment. They knew they were attacking America, but many did not know the enormous strategic consequences of the strike. The secrecy was so intense that even senior officers only received partial information. Fukuda later criticized this secrecy, saying it robbed the pilots of the ability to understand the true weight of their actions. He said, "We fought responsibly, but we were not given responsible information." He was equally critical of Japan's unwillingness to surrender sooner. He described watching the war drag on long after it was obvious the empire had no chance of winning. Cities burned, resources vanished, families starved, soldiers were ordered to fight to the death in hopeless battles. Even after the atomic bombings, factions inside the Japanese government wanted to continue the war. Fukuda called this the final tragedy of misguided pride. One question he was asked repeatedly was whether he ever regretted giving the tora signal. For many years he avoided answering directly, but near the end of his life he finally gave a clear response. He said that he regretted the suffering the war caused on all sides, American, Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, Australian. But he also said something few expected. I regret that we were so ignorant of the world we lived in. We acted with confidence but without wisdom. He explained that the true lesson of Pearl Harbor was not about strategy or tactics, but about understanding the cost of failing to see humanity beyond one's own borders. He believed that nations go to war not because they hate each other, but because they fail to understand each other. He said, "If I had met one American pilot before the war, perhaps I would have seen the world differently." As he aged, his perspective softened further. He became fascinated with the idea of reconciliation, not just between nations, but between individuals. He believed that forgiveness was one of the strongest forces in the world, capable of healing wounds that governments could not. He often said, "The weapons of war end quickly. The weapons of peace take longer but reach deeper." In his final interviews, he expressed amazement at how the United States and Japan became allies after the war, even friends. He saw young Americans visiting Japan, fascinated by its culture. He saw Japanese companies opening in the United States, building cars and electronics. He saw veterans of both sides shaking hands at reunions. This transformation, he believed, was one of the greatest victories humanity ever achieved, far greater than any battlefield triumph. He died in 1976, but his story did not end there. Historians continue to study his writings and speeches because they offer a rare glimpse into the mind of a man who stood at the center of one of the most important moments in world history. He was not perfect, not always honest, not always objective, but he was uniquely positioned to share truths that no one else could. Today, when people visit the USS Arizona Memorial, they stand above the same waters where Fukuda once saw flames rising into the sky. Some come to mourn, some come to learn, some come simply to understand the past. But all of them walk across a bridge between two nations that once fought bitterly, and later built one of the strongest alliances in the world. And somewhere in that long chain of events between war and peace, between memory and reconciliation, stands the complicated figure of Mitsuo Fukuda, a man defined by a single morning, yet transformed by everything that came after it. As Mitsuo Fukuda aged, his memory of that morning over Pearl Harbor did not fade. It sharpened. He described it later as if the entire world had been suspended in one breath. One moment in which history pivoted. The sound of the engines, the flashing sunlight over the water, the rising columns of smoke, all of it became clearer with time rather than dimmer. He admitted that for decades he replayed the scene in his mind, examining each second, each decision, each signal he sent. Fukuda once said that the moment he radioed Tora, he believed he had just ensured the survival of the Japanese Empire. But years later, he came to believe that those same words had begun Japan's destruction. This was the paradox that shaped the rest of his life. The realization that a moment he thought was victory had actually been the beginning of defeat. In conversations with historians, he explained that Japan's leaders had convinced themselves that the United States would negotiate quickly after a shocking blow. This was a fatal misunderstanding. He spoke openly about how Japanese intelligence analysts failed to grasp the industrial power of the United States. They measured ships, aircraft, and manpower, but they never measured willpower. Fukuda believed this was Japan's greatest strategic blindness, far greater than underestimating American technology. He recalled the first time he saw American factories after the war. He was stunned by their scale and efficiency. He wrote that walking through a Detroit assembly plant felt like watching a machine that produced strength itself. He understood then why Japan never had a chance in a prolonged conflict. He later said, "We misjudged not America's size but America's determination." One personal moment that profoundly affected him occurred when he visited a naval museum and saw a detailed model of the USS Arizona. He recognized the ship instantly. He had seen its destruction from above. The museum's staff did not know who he was at first. They simply described the ship's history and the lives lost on it. When they later learned they had just given the tour to the man who led the attack, there was a long silence. Fukuda later said that silence taught him more about humanity than any political speech. Throughout the 1960s, when Fukuda lectured across the United States, he was confronted by veterans who had fought in the Pacific. Some approached him with anger, some with curiosity, some simply wanting answers. Fukuda always listened. He never attempted to justify the attack. Instead, he focused on explaining the mentality of a nation pushed into war by ambition, fear, pride, and desperation. He believed that individual soldiers often carried the burden of decisions made by leaders far above them. He spoke frequently about the emotional cost of being a symbol, both for Japan and for the United States. In Japan, he had once been praised as a national hero, the man who delivered the decisive blow. After the war, he became a symbol of the empire's mistakes. In America, he was seen first as an enemy,